Hello, all. I was just telling Nirmal, it would have been lovely to have you face to face. But I think this has got some advantages as well. So I'm glad that at least we get this chance to discuss these ideas. As Nirmal mentioned, I'll be breaking this into two parts. One that has sort of worked for us, and we managed to scale things up using knowledge, money, and political will. Um, and the second part is really about the cities and how to crack that nut. And I'm sort of half looking for ideas myself as to what the gaps might be and how we could tackle the second part particularly. So just a quick introduction to IFC for those who don't know, and this is the only little advertisement. So the idea is to just give you a sense of where we are coming from. I'm sure you've heard of the World Bank Group, but I work for the part of the World Bank Group that deals with private sector. So we're the largest investor, dedicated investor in the private sector in emerging markets, really. And so we do all sorts of investment, equity, debt, and so on. And we work both with developers and the banks and governments and NGOs and all of that. So that's kind of a broad role. And so before I dive into the green buildings world, I just wanted to share the context that we are looking at from our perspective, at least. So the first part is really kind of understanding what's good, what's happening, right? And I'm sure you know a lot of this stuff quite a bit, but I just want to lay it out there. Firstly, in terms of climate change, the greenhouse gas emissions from buildings is significant, right? Almost 20%. And actually, that 20% is slightly misleading because, if you consider that a lot of the transport happens between buildings and a lot of the manufacturing is building materials because most of the built stuff is, the physical entity that you live in, right? But frankly, according to the UN protocol, that's the share of the buildings, and that's already big. And about 12% comes from electricity, and another 6% comes from on-site burning. So direct burning, and obviously electricity usage has an indirect effect as well, right? But if you consider that the growth in construction is so significant, particularly in Asia, Asia Pacific, thanks to India, China, Indonesia, and those countries, it's one of the reasons I've actually decided to move to Singapore for a bit, really, myself. But the thing is that the new growth stock is mostly, if you look at this, mostly in developing countries. It's significant and it's big. Just to give you a sense, China alone is predicted to have another 250 million people still move into cities, right? Indian stock is meant to double in the next 10 to 15 years. It might be slightly delayed thanks to COVID, but basically there's still a lot more urbanization yet to happen in a lot of the Asian countries. And that story repeats itself across, right? So there's increase in stock and increase in urbanization, but there's also demographics that's shifting, right? So people are getting more nuclear. The homes that we might count as homes, people are upgrading into apartments, moving, even within the city into better and as the affluence rises. So the middle class growth and the standard of living growth is also causing other impacts, as I'll share quickly. So just to give you a sense, a slightly different take, which you may not have seen before, is that if you take the two big countries, US and India, and the carbon emissions from that, the buildings itself would be bigger than any of these two countries, just what that looks like in a sense, right? So significant already, that's the current buildings, as you can see, the 9 gigatons. Out of the 50 gigatons that we currently pollute, 9 is just from buildings, right? For example. But you can see the prediction is another 7 is yet to come, which is really the scary bit. And no other sector has this kind of growth. If you look at transport, it's more or less going to stabilize, right? Especially with electric cars coming in the future and so on. But really, the building sector is still kind of growing as if nothing is different today, right? So that's kind of something to think about. And the real issue here is that if the right investments are not done, then buildings last for 40 to 70 years. So you're locking in inefficiencies for a very long time, right? So unlike, say, a car that may last 10 years, this is much longer impact. So anything you do today has a big impact. And if you don't do today, it's actually a bit too late to deal with it later. Existing buildings are much tougher to deal with. Adding to that is this affluence that I was talking about earlier. If you look at air conditioning, in developing countries like India, Vietnam, and places, it's rising by about 20%. And just to give you a sense, if you just, and this was an interesting analysis done that showed that if Mumbai alone, had the cooling demand met like the US, or I would even say Singapore, but US, then India would have, then as much air conditioning demand as, the air conditioning demand in Mumbai is almost a quarter of US's demand. Just so many people, and the humidity and the cooling demand is huge. So that's really something to think about. And imagine, all of that spread across India is just one city, and the rest of Asia. So it's really, if there's one thing that is going to destroy the planet, it might just be the cooling of buildings alone, if I had to put one thing down there, right? But on the flip side, it's an opportunity too, because it's yet to happen in a sense. So how do we deal with it is something that we are, kind of grappling with. But let's step back a little bit. So, if you look at our past, our quintessential Indian homes were built to be quite socially relevant and quite responsive to seasonal variations and climate and so on. But most of the time they were set in a rural environment, probably single story, with well ventilated courtyards, with good protection, with the inner shading and things like that. But the trouble is that, this context, if you're superimposed in this context, is really not scalable, right? I mean, you could imagine that with the heat and dust of today's reality, it's an extravagance to have, and we might romanticize about a courtyard house, but, how many people can afford that sort of land to build a house, and that sort of spread, right? So we really have to think again as to, how do we get a context that is able to deal with today's noise, dust, and COVID, if you like. How do we deal with these issues in today's reality? And I feel like developing countries haven't yet cracked this, properly. But I feel like that one other dimension I wanted to add to this is that if you think about, World Bank research shows that the bottom of the pyramid, which is about 25% of the low income of the income category, pays about 20% of the expendable income towards cost of electricity, water, fuel, right? So that's significant as well. So it's not just about a nice to have that you give up some air conditioning. It's expensive stuff for most people, especially the bottom of the pyramid, if you like, right? I just wanted to add one more dimension, which again seems to be missed in the narrative, is building materials, right? Obviously embodied energy, I'm sure you've heard of, it's a significant part. But I think one thing that doesn't get mentioned, particularly for Asia, is the manufacturing of bricks and materials like that is one of the, look at that Dhaka, more than almost 60% of air quality issues, air pollution in Dhaka comes from the brick kilns that surround the city. And that's really true for most of Asia, South Asia and China, I would say. Still very brick-based construction. And that's, if you think about intermittent kilns and how, kind of wasteful they are, but just the amount of energy that goes into these bricks. I think we also have to make sure we understand that just because it was traditional doesn't make it better or doesn't make it environmental. There's a kind of attachment I noticed, particularly, the kind of mid-century with the exposed bricks, and somehow you saved a little bit of plaster, but actually the big issue is the brick itself, right? And a concrete jungle it's sometimes better than a brick jungle, if you like. So okay, let's consider that. So I wanted to end with this this part with this kind of thought that I don't think this is an easy one for us, particularly in Asia, where we've got the rising urbanization still to come, a doubling of stock, resource crunch. There's not even a climate change issue. There's no resources in a lot of Asia. And then you have the impact of climate change all coming at the same time. And you can see this in Indonesia and India and places like that, where you get hit by big issues. I think it's a time bomb or a perfect storm, right, waiting to happen. And I think that this really needs a more dynamic effort where we need to bring the corporates, the governments, the developers, the banks, the building professionals, and the occupants to help transform this market. It's not going to be an easy one. In some ways, it is tangible, but in some other ways, it's a big issue in a sense. So if you thought that was a problem, but the problem is yet to come. I was just laying out the context, right? The problem is this: hmm, the kind of buildings we built, right? Excessive glass, and this is an extreme version where there's so much ignorance, right? Irony and tragedy, to like, because of the lack of common sense, such as this, that it's really what is causing all that 20% pollution in a way, right? And of course, air conditioning is something we may have to deal with some of the issues, but we don't have to be so wasteful as well, in terms of the amount of glass, as if we don't have sort of the load that comes from it. It's this sort of issue that creates 80% of the economic value, according to a calculation that anything like, which is 1 or 2 year payback, is 80% of that is being left out. And it really is mind-boggling. Why would people build like this? And how come building professionals are able to kind of get away with doing this? I mean, imagine a car, which had 80% of its value not being built in. You would not get that, right? So, I mean, how is the building industry able to get through? I wanted to share this lovely image of Renzo Piano's building. Nothing wrong with Renzo Piano himself. I wanted to use that as a case study, as a case to make a point. And this was his inspiration. Apparently he sat in a cafe in London, and he saw the beautiful river and the railway and the way this energy blends, and he began to sketch using a green felt pen on a napkin on what he saw was a giant sail or an iceberg. It's this sort of rubbish that inspires our design industry, right? I mean, seriously, you know. So I think another architect, said, we have designed more and more complicated glass boxes for the last 30 years, and rather than accepting that this is not working, we seem to somehow think that having multiple layers of glass and somehow having better properties of glass is the solution somehow. It's this sort of tragedy that is causing some of these problems. I think we as the building professionals, I count myself as one, even though I work in a bank. It's kind of this sort of not looking at things objectively and being a slightly delusional state is the problem. So not the only problem, but definitely one, right? The ignorance of it. The second is, I find worse than ignorance is preconceived ideas of what is right. This is a bus or a whole set of buses in France that has this green roof on top, right? And you carry this dead weight around with its water, and it's just somebody hasn't done the numbers on this, right? In terms of what is the benefit of a little bit of heat island effect or whatever that might help, versus carrying all this dead weight around the bus. And it's most likely, a few months later that would have just burnt itself out, right? And then who would maintain all of this, this kind of green on top? So I think, I feel like there's ignorance, of course, but there's also kind of preconceived ideas of what is right in the industry, which has prevailed a long time. And I feel like we're not looking at the numbers well enough. There's lots of these kind of arrows that flow in the buildings, and we've come up with concepts that aren't really scientifically analyzed well enough. I've got some repeated slides. Sorry about that. So what I was wanting to put down here was that I feel like there's an opportunity, at least in the building space, to really think about today's context and not being too overly romantic about our past, because only a few had those kind of houses, right? And the context has changed. We're living a lot more denser, compact, land sparse environment, right? So, but we do need a new vision, particularly for Asia. I think that some of the Western world and probably even the New World in Latin America can probably manage with some of the things that they carry, right? But I think we really need to think sharper about how we deal with it. Some of my sort of notes got slightly scrambled. Forgive me about this, but I wanted to just share the comparison of the 80% I was talking about of the value, and you can see that industrial buildings, there's a lot less left out, and building industry seems to have a lot more left out. Okay, and in terms of investment opportunity, there is no kind of industry that provides that much green opportunity. So almost $24 trillion of investment opportunity is based on our calculations. Most of that is in the building industry, the green buildings part. So it's an opportunity and a challenge at the same time, right? So why is this challenge happening? To leave the architects alone, what is going on, right? So there is this thing about circular blame. This guy, we know the misalignment of incentives, but if you ask yourself, would you like to live in an energy efficient house? Which person is going to say no, right? But most of the time, they can't find any. It's not easy to find a greenhouse to live in. I moved here, there was no way to kind of quickly figure out if my house is green, right? And if you ask the builders, they say, yeah, there's no demand from developers. The developers say investors are not interested, and investors say there's no demand. So the whole thing just rotates itself, and this the whole circle of blame. And there needs to be a more kind of transparent, sort of label, we call it, but some sort of recognition that captures the value of superior buildings. I think that's kind of one of the issues that we felt we had to tackle as a problem, right? The second is, clients, as I mentioned earlier, preconceived ideas, as you saw earlier. How does a client really know what is the right thing, right? They depend on consultants, and consultants have their own preconceived ideas. And when it comes to kind of, designing some of these and analyzing some of these, the design is already done, and you kind of have the CAD drawings and you run some simulations, and it's probably a bit late by the time you get to the point to help the client. And the client, is by that time, 6 months down the line, is waiting for the design to come. They have no patience left. The money is ticking. They borrowed money on the land, and the rest they have to get construction going. So really, the client is not informed at all as to what is the right thing to do, right? So this is the big challenge. And if you ask, there was a study done by the World Green Building Council that found that if you ask a typical client, they would assume that a green construction is about 30% more expensive, right? 30%. When in reality, it's more like 0.5 to 2% more expensive in terms of construction costs to get to a reasonable energy efficiency standard, right? So this misconception is another driver for it. Okay. The next one is, green buildings can be pretty ordinary. We tend to be very driven, as I mentioned earlier, by a visual, inspiration. But this building that we found, this was an affordable housing in Bangalore in southern India, and it didn't look that amazing. It didn't shout green, definitely. But when we scratch the surface, you find that actually the developers used reflective paint. It's got insulation. All the windows are well shaded. If you go a bit further, it has solar hot water system, and it has 2 pipes. It has a sewage treatment plant that supplies the water back for flushing. So a lot of good, practical things that matter to people there, right? And it reduces about 30% of the operating cost for the home buyers there. And but the problem was that they didn't have a way to kind of to showcase their work. How do you communicate good investment into their project to their customers? So these are the kind of aspects. So, and when we approached them, things like LEED was not really practical as a label for affordable housing projects. I mean, some of these assessments could cost more than a couple of flats there, right? So it's kind of expensive for some of these developers too. So we really were thinking, okay, so those are the sort of aspects, perceived cost, lack of knowing what to do first from a client's perspective, and this, recognition for doing the right thing was some of the things that inspired us to think about, okay, how do we come up with, a simple, smart, and affordable way to scale up this? How do we get this out there so that we can, actually, we had a bit of our own, sort of interest in mind. We wanted to invest in green projects, and we tend to go for affordable projects, but we couldn't find them to be, available, right? And we couldn't nudge them to go for, standards that were just, too expensive and frankly not focused on climate change and resource efficiency. So we set ourselves, to kind of be able to tell these numbers, to tell a story, because solutions have to be had to be easy to recognize, had to be simple, smart, and had to be kind of scalable in a way. Right. So let me move to what we developed. We started this work about, I would say, 6 years ago. In earnest, in building this up, and we built this platform called edgebuildings.com. It's basically a platform for green buildings, and I'll quickly explain the various components of it. But the core of this was a tool, software that is online, does calculations on the cloud, has a lot of the data built in, so that there was no excuse to not do the right things. Okay, we started off with clients in mind. I'm not saying this is not meant to be kind of sophisticated simulation software. How can we let clients have the right tool in the right time, right? We started off with that, and then it started to build and start to make sense. And today we do teaching 14 universities. We have training programs for teach the professors in Vietnam, Indonesia, and other places where we're trying to scale this in and build it into the design world. But it started off with a very humble idea of how do we get our clients interested in a cost benefit analysis too. So the idea is that you can choose any type of building and you can quickly click on what measures work and it will show you what difference it makes. Let me run a quick video. Hopefully, Nirmal, please confirm if the audio is okay. If it's not okay.
Architects can make a big difference by incorporating passive design features in their work without having to let go of creativity. Let's see how easy it is to use the Edge app to create an office building that is at least 20% less resource intensive than an ordinary building. Our project is located in South Africa and is 15,000 square meters and 10 stories high. Let's move to the Energy tab and see what difference it makes to select a few passive design strategies. We'll choose smaller windows that are well shaded so our office building avoids overheating through excessive solar gains. As soon as we indicate this, we have a 14% reduction in energy use. Let's select daylighting controls to ensure that the lights around the perimeter of the building will be dimmed or shut off when there is adequate daylight. Overall, energy consumption is now down by close to 20%. How can we shape the building to further optimize the performance? Let's go back to the Design tab and orient our building to the north. The performance has improved to almost 30%. Our building doesn't have to have uniform windows. Instead, certain facades can have more glazing than others to ensure that we don't design a dull building. We can select and compare passive design technologies for further energy reduction, such as natural ventilation with openable windows or glass with low emissive coating. With Edge, you're able to explain to your clients the extra cost of building green and the payback period. In this case, it is less than 2 years before your clients enjoy a return on their investment, which is reflected in South African rand. As an architect, you can keep the dynamic facades of your building while making sensible choices to optimize its performance. Edge helps you design a green building that lowers running costs for your client while keeping the integrity of your design. Architects
Sorry, I was trying to move on. Okay, so what I hope that was useful. I was telling Nirmal I take a long time to explain this, so it was just useful to have somebody just say it in 2 minutes. Please have a look at this. It's free to use. I didn't mention that, and we've invested over the years. Replayed the engine many times, and today you can even find Singapore and Japan and other countries built in. So it's pretty much most countries are kind of built in. So actually, P.S. Jaykumar, who was the owner of that project, and we finally invested in that project too, managed to get a certificate, to show what difference their project was making. And that made a big difference in terms of being able to raise funds with investors and also to explain it to the clients. I mean, this is not the clients of that project. We've done this so many places. There's a project in Turkey. And what we did was, it's not a housing project that gets a certificate. But finally, every home buyer gets it because based on their house, right? It acts as a little label. And the idea is that the home buyer can then go to the bank and get better preferential rate mortgages. That was the logic of it, right? And also it informs the home buyer what's special about my house. And if those things are not there, they can call us and let us know that there's something wrong with the kind of rating we've given. So that's the logic of it. I want you to hear this from the home buyer's perspective. So I'm going to run a short video that will walk you through.
This is Candlewood Crescent. I'm proud to say it was the first EDGE certified residential development in South Africa. Our saving in this complex is 30% over and above base case on electricity and 30% over base case on water.
We have a smart meter that allows us to use solar energy as well, to complement the electricity that we get.
And it gives feedback to the tenant on the actual electricity consumption.
With the smart meter, I can save up to 400 Rand a month.
EDGE, I think, is most definitely a game changer. I believe in things that are tangible and have tangible results.
So what I wanted to see was the language they were using. That's why I brought that here. You saw the developer was using numbers to explain, right? And showing how much they would save, how much. We will need to change the narrative from very broad kind of soft and fuzzy kind of green narrative to hard numbers where they can communicate. Okay, I've done so much, I put in so much, you will save X amount, $20. That market then starts to make sense. I'm not suggesting we don't need the softer stuff. We definitely do, but we can't do this without communicating the basic things first. I think that's what I'm trying to get at, right? So in terms of numbers, we have been able to scale this reasonably well. I mean, we've got 17 million square meters of projects that have gone through certification and rising actually. So so we kind of have this. It's a global product, obviously, and we've got many users and we have training and all of that. But I think that one, you can have a look at our website. You can get more. But what I wanted to share was the thinking around how we built this. I hope to kind of get you guys thinking about when you do your next inspiration, how would you build this product, in terms of market transformation, right? So in places like Vietnam, South Africa, Colombia, I would say Peru, even Indonesia, almost 6 to 7% of all new construction just voluntarily has adopted the standard. It's made a big difference. So that's been the most gratifying thing for us, in terms of seeing this brand move. And have the value. Of course, it used to be a minimum standard of 20%. We now even have a zero carbon certificate because we are numbers based. We can go, we can have different. We have a 40% standard called EDGE Advanced and a zero carbon certificate just to help the Paris Agreement and kind of push those commitments. We're getting a strong demand for that too. So from our perspective, just selfishly, we've been able to do investments thanks to this. Today, we have a $6 billion portfolio. And we do about $1 billion a year using this. And really, previously investment would have driven some of our work. Today, EDGE drives investment. You can see the hotspots for where the green thing is. And there's a button in EDGE where you can say, I want to be approached by an investor. You click that and you get a bank call you saying, I'm interested in financing your project because I've got some, climate related money. I can go into the details of that, but that's kind of what we're trying to build, an ecosystem where there's transparency. The homeowner can check, the developer is able to get the investor knows that there's a market. So if you can make that work, that's kind of where we saw this work. Obviously, all of this is voluntary. We hope that we want to push it as IFC up to 20%, and we hope that that could be the tipping point for new construction to go green, and then hopefully that will just take off by itself, right, as we see it. We have not only done, I just wanted to be clear, there's nothing like having government standards where applicable, right? So of course, we work on the voluntary standard, but government standards, we've been working almost a decade. I personally have been helping the Jakarta codes and some of the other codes, Vietnam, so depending on what the government wants, some haven't worked, I'll be honest. And in hindsight, we can see why Bangladesh hasn't worked for us. And we can go into that too. But some of the places like Colombia, amazing success, and the incentives that you get from Peru, even Mongolia, we focused on labeling of existing buildings. We can go into that. And if you get a chance, have a look at our policy review paper. That talks about how these things have worked and what the results are. So we published that result from our codes work as well. Now, just stepping back, what did we do? We helped create the building stock using the tool to publish it. we certified that, because in financing world, at least, somebody's word is not good, especially when you're trying to scale. You need to have a certificate. There's no other way out. Whether you think it's too clunky and too red tapey or green tapey, you just need to have somebody validate this, right? So that certification really helps in the process. And then we were able to scale it further. I wanted to share how we were able to kind of maneuver this across. So obviously, Edge is at the center of this. I mean, typically, in the green buildings world, it's a conversation between a speculative client and his assessor, right? A lead AP or something like that. We wanted to approach it more multidimensionally, where we wanted to get the government involved, the banks involved, the developer involved, and then try to move the market that way. So what are the lessons we learned in this? We found actually, this is more art than science. You throw all of those things and something sticks. And in some places, nothing sticks. That's the other thing. But I wanted to share humbly, that we think that, oh, wow, we can actually, complex things. I think, Nirmal, you and I were talking about this earlier, right? Complex things, you just have to have those things and then hope and kind of nurture them as they go forward. Because they're just not complicated. These things are socioeconomic things are too complex as well. So sometimes it starts off with an investment we made in South Africa, which you just heard them speak, right? That investment led to us signing an agreement with the Green Building Council, and then we got a whole bunch of developers sign up that all the projects would be green, and that led to some more investments and so on. So today we've got banks funding these projects. But it started with a little seed investment through a property fund. Okay. The second example is Colombia, which has been amazing. I wish we can even have a whole talk on just the Colombia story. Just in 2 years, they were able to have 10%, 13% of the market change in 2 years, just from one or two banks, right? The bank, we issued a green bond. So they issued a green bond, we bought it. So basically $100 million, just to kind of play around with the green mortgages and the green construction finance market. It started to have huge interest, and they started to raise even more money. They issued 2 other bonds after that. I think the market is big enough for almost $1 billion of properties, right? So, and then we had other banks starting to issue bonds. So we teamed up with the green, we learned the lesson. We felt working with the Chamber of Commerce, the Construction Chamber of Commerce. That's how it translates. We teamed up with them, and they had all the developers, signed up to this, and we started to offer training through universities, and it's been a game changer, really, especially in the housing market, which is a tough nut to crack. It's been transformational in that space, and we'd love to share more on that if you like. And the third story is more closer to home. It's Saputra, which is in Indonesia. Over the years, we've helped them with affordable housing projects. Our role is to work with top developers and help them to go down the economic scale and try to build more affordable housing using their balance sheet to kind of take some of that risk. But there we teamed up with Green Building Council of Indonesia. They've been training lots of professors and things like that. But in parallel, we've been working with the government in writing the building codes for Jakarta. And we got the government, we'll wait and see whether that gets through, is to have a standard of 30% carbon reduction in Jakarta by 2030. That was the aspiration. So now we're trying to see how we can connect it to refurbishment and existing buildings as well. So it's that's the story from Indonesia. So you can see things can happen from multiple angles in terms of how you move this forward. And what also is interesting is that very important to stay in for the long term. Things may not move very quickly in the beginning, especially government. But once the government sees the market has moved, they started to add value here. So you can see a bit like Singapore has, you have the property bonus, right? If you each higher score or green mark and things. So we started to get those kind of initiatives happening. But you can see some of those sort of ideas that are coming through as government incentives in this space. It's tremendously useful. In Peru, we've got almost no investment, but government incentives where you get an extra story, an extra floor. If you do EDGE certified homes, has meant we've got a whole conveyor belt of developers landing up, right? Because there's so much value in having an extra floor. So that sort of has worked as well. And finally, we learned that actually having a multi-pronged product approach for financing is critical. What I mean by that is allow developers to do green construction finance. In 2 years later, they'll come back to you for green mortgages. And 3 years later, they'll come back to you for capital markets, the green bonds, to raise even more capital, right? Remember, banks are just shopkeepers that deal with money, right? So they need to keep taking money and disposing it and putting it into assets. So we felt that, by having it sort of systematic like that, the bank is able to cross-sell. You see, they can sell the product once to the developer and then to the home buyer and then to the investors. So the same product will be sold so many times, and the banks are kind of finding this very good. I wanted to share how we made the economic argument. So I want you to see the power of numbers, right? It took us a long time to get there. I would be the last person to say it was easy. But what we did was we showed how if you have a standard mortgage, sorry about the error in spelling, but standard mortgage and the green mortgage, and if you assume that a green project is about 3% more cost, it may not be for a $50,000 house, but let's say $1,500 more. The down payment is a little bit more for the home buyer. You see, the loan amount is slightly more, to accommodate that extra amount. But the rates, even if you keep the rates the same and the term, the same, what happens is the monthly payment, obviously, on the mortgage is a bit high, but fundamentally for the end user, they're saving $20, let's say, right? So when you look at net cost of ownership, it's actually lower than the standard. Okay? This is how we made the argument to banks, that actually you're reducing risk by giving them a little bit more money. You see, that's when the penny dropped. So what I mean by that is, even though we allowed if the eligibility of based on income is 4 times your annual income is how much you could borrow, we were nudging the banks to take a little bit more, because fundamentally the client is having a little bit extra disposable income, which can absorb the mortgage cost. I can explain this further if you like, but this is an important way to explain things to financial industry. And a lot of times the banks themselves, we've just invested in OCBC and so on. They themselves are coming up with incentives to mobilize the market as they want to capture more and more of the market share, right? And including discounts and interest rates, not just about using the risk reduction logic, but there's also discounts and other things, and also paying for the cost of certification. Lots of other ways that you can do this. And finally, we've been capturing data. It's still early days, but we are trying to capture, did it actually cost so much as we expected? Not just hypothetical cost in edge. In reality, what was the additional cost? So we're finding it's roughly about 1% construction cost. If you go really down the food chain, if you're building for very low income housing, then it may be as a percentage of the construction cost, it may be a little bit more like 2 or 3% of construction cost. So that's something to bear in mind. We are also trying to capture other costs as well. I'll come to that. But what I would love to see more in this industry, that's kind of where we're headed, is to make the argument economically, right? Through numbers. So let me explain. So if we can show that a builder who does green is selling it slightly at a premium, 4 to 8%, he's able to is able to kind of sell it faster, because if you sell the property faster, he's using capital better. That's value, right? That's one way to do that. Obviously, for buyers, it's a reduction in cost. But for banks, our research has shown that default on mortgages that go to energy efficient homes are 33% lower. This is a game changer, guys. If you can have 33% lower default on loans, what we call delinquency, that's the argument, right? Because it may not be a correlation, may just be maybe a correlation, may not be a causation, if you see what I mean. But it's quite powerful if you can make the economic argument that you're actually going to be, reducing your risk of defaulting on loans. And finally, there's data coming through from EPC labels in Europe and places where resale value of A and B rated labels are almost 10% higher, right? That's the sort of value we need to bring to this system, is our sense. Okay, so I'll kind of end this segment, which is about buildings, and share that it's still work glass half full, but we're beginning to see a path, to kind of scale this up, and we managed to do this reasonably well in 8 countries, and now we're kind of spreading that across. Obviously, a platform is open to any country in the world, But we're kind of, adding new cities, adding more partnerships, and growing this business as we see fit, right? And the main thing is to kind of approach it from a multi-pronged approach. So the question now, is kind of how could we use this kind of way of approaching a problem, to a larger context. Obviously, a bunch of building is not a city, right? And a whole bunch of green buildings doesn't make a green community or a green city either. So I totally appreciate it. But it's worth doing it still at a commodified level, and then see how we can bunch it up and see how that works. But how can we take this approach at a larger scale was the question we were asking, particularly because cities, are critical for sustainable development. Most of the GDP is made in cities, and I don't have to convince people who live in a city state that this is of value, but it's sort of, you can see the numbers speak for itself. Most of the carbon emissions come from cities as well. So, we talk about those big numbers, but most of that is from the city as well. So again, if we don't get these cities right, I don't think we'll make it work. So I would say cooling, air conditioning, buildings, maybe communities and cities. That's the path. If you don't fix those, then we are in trouble, I feel, because the rest is important, but it's not on the critical path, right, to meeting and tackling climate change. So let's look at some of the challenges. Obviously, cities have some advantages. They're much more nimble, right, compared to states and countries. And they are a lot more vulnerable as well. You can see with COVID what happens to our cities. And because densities also means that we can have more efficient infrastructure. And look, cities I'm not suggesting they're a problem. I mean, in fact, they're a solution in a way, right? Having density is a great way to approach life. But basically, they also face huge amount of difficulty. I mean, a lot of our cities, they are on paper an entity, but a lot of times they just loose kind of formation of an institution, right? They don't necessarily have the right urban planning or technical expertise. They're kind of, they don't have enough private sector investment. A lot of them, I want to use the analogy of a hotel, right? You cannot fix the hotel using the cash flow. You need to find some way that the city can borrow and kind of upgrade itself. But the cash flow might be able to change a few light bulbs or fix some potholes on the road and build an extra school as it expands. But fundamental change is not possible without good capital. And private sector is really the way to go. And governments themselves are grappling. I mean, COVID is a good example of where this becomes a problem. So that makes the creditworthiness super important. And most of the cities are not creditworthy for many reasons, and we can go into that. But I think having national governments play a role in that and making them creditworthy, but also kind of for them to explore different financing models like PPP, land value capture, and raising money from the private sector through bonds and other things has to be the way that they approach this subject. And basically, they also don't have good projects. So if you think about buildings, you never hear like a country saying, oh, we would wish we were building a lot more buildings. We don't have enough private sector. We do have a bit too many private sector players, in fact, right? The capital lands and others are building our cities. Why is that not happening in infrastructure play? The main reason is the banker projects are not coming out because there's a lot of money, there's $100 trillion of investor money, and only 0.3 of that, is going into infrastructure. Okay, so very little is going into city infrastructure. Most of it is going into wherever it does, right? So this is really the challenge, really. Why is it not going there? How can we unlock it, right? And then if you look at what it need, the sense is that in order to have a successful kind of transition or plan, you need to have sort of long-term. Sorry about the spelling again. Long-term vision, right? To make it work, you need to have good an analytical view for this. You need to be able to, because if you have limited amount of funds, you can't be wasting it on things, right, that are less effective. Let me give you an example. A lot of times, what makes a lot of publicity tends to be very gold-plated things like metro. You have a ribbon-cutting opportunity. It costs a lot of money for having a small amount of savings in terms of increase in public transport, right? Whereas something like reducing parking areas or increasing parking fees on the street parking is politically so tricky, but has almost no capital expense, right? So it's about knowing how do you balance those things? How do you get those things out there? It's important. And obviously, we need good regulatory framework, and a favorable market condition. That's obvious. And then I think that infrastructure does have a role. I feel like, I don't believe that just having, Singapore just went ahead and kind of had these quotas and vehicles, and that would have solved the problem. You need to have decent infrastructure, right, as a catalyst, as a trigger to make things work. So you do need some of that already. So that's kind of what I've kind of we're kind of looking at this in a way. And cities are the front line of climate change, don't forget. So they seem like in the right position. I mean, if you just look at US as well, in spite of the national government having one kind of rhetoric, the cities were going ahead and doing their thing, right? Because they knew that it had to be the way they had to do it. There's no other way out of this. So what is promising is that I've just put like a few cities here. That's the one thing that I like to do is to check if anybody has done it. Has anybody? The question I was asking is, has anybody managed to reduce significant amount in 10 years? Or just kind of nice to have, right? And I wanted to share a few ideas, right? So if you look at London, they managed to reduce almost 40% in sort of 15 years, which is pretty decent number, right? If you think about it. Arlington, which is a small little place, but has managed to reduce vehicle kilometer travel in private cars by 38%, almost 40% in 10 years, which is quite significant as well, right? So if you look at Vancouver, but some of these things are obvious. I don't want to read them all out, but I want you to get a sense that it might, cities seem very static, right? They seem like, oh, if Singapore invested 30 years ago, that's why we're getting this. Actually, it can be done in 10 years time with good planning, with good thinking, at least on certain variables, you can make it work. Is the sense I'm getting. Okay, these are obviously fairly well-known and affluent cities. I give you that, but at least it's technically feasible to make this reduction. And potentially, we have done this analysis in IFC that shows, what is the investment opportunity is huge, right? So it's just a matter of knowing how to open up that investment opportunity, but it goes into ridiculous amount, $30 trillion, right? And we know $100 trillion exists with investors. So it's not like it can't be fixed. It's about how do you bring this together, right, in various markets. And you can see the biggest chunk of this is Asia, 17 of that. One last thing in the context part I wanted to add was, there's a lot of interest in kind of looking at how do we rebuild after COVID and things like that. And I did some quick analysis to show that the jobs in urban areas, and particularly green jobs in urban areas, has the highest bang for buck or jobs for buck. If you look at it that way, right? So there's nothing, and it's not rocket science. When you have a lot of people doing things in urban areas, that creates more jobs, right? Metro does not necessarily create that, but things like forestry, refurbishment, where you have lots of people doing it, obviously creates more jobs. So I think there is that conversation to be had. I think we need to connect it. So it's obviously important, again, from a city's perspective, you have to talk the language of a city. You can't just say, oh, I need you to get to CO2 reduction, right? That will not make sense. Singapore didn't set out to reduce CO2. They set out to become water neutral and become, better at what they do in terms of managing their risk and security. So I'm just sort of bringing that context here. So what are we looking in our heads? How do we set up a way to connect knowledge, money, and political will, create a market? We feel, this is early days. Okay, I'll be honest. This is very early for us, and this is why I was so interested in speaking to you guys. The current thinking is that maybe we need something that makes it very easy for city to prioritize what they should be putting the money and effort onto, right? I'll show you what I mean by that. And we probably need something to monitor this over the long period, because if you don't have a way to kind of rate a city and monitor it, you will not get investors interested, because if they don't really know if it's green, then it'll pretty much become a greenwash and nobody will buy it. So that's an important component. We know financing is important, and particularly private sector financing, that's important. We know that we can't do this purely from financing. We need to get policies and action as well. And finally, we need partnerships. We need to get people. And I say partnerships in a loose way. We need to get all the stakeholders, NGOs, the civic society, the academics, participating in the decision making of what goes on in the city. So that's kind of the components we think today would work. And right now we are focused, I think from my side at least, I'm looking at how do we at least get this angle right? How do we get at least the knowledge piece sorted and the cost piece sorted, okay? And so over the last couple of years, we've been collecting data of what has worked in multiple cities, right? In Curitiba, in Medellin, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Bogota. So some really good precedents and evidence that shows things have worked. And not just in developed countries, even in developing countries, Johannesburg, and some of the other ones. I mean, you can see some of the ideas that are there. We try to kind of put that in a pot and see how we can communicate this to other cities to get them inspired to do the right thing. So we built this platform. Please have a look. It's called apexcities.com. And there's a little website to it. And it's very basic at this stage. Intentionally, we wanted to focus and test this out. We are currently testing it our own clients. We're not really open to hundreds of people using it just now, but the intention is to open it at some point. And I think there's one city you can play with, I think Durban, just to get a sense of how the tool works. But please do request option to use it, and when the time comes, we'll open it and you will have access to it as well. So this is the platform. We want to kind of come up with something that makes sense, and sort of what we wanted to do is to change the narrative from a carbon narrative of must do to how do we make you water secure, right? How do we make your public transport higher? How do we make your waste issues better in terms of managing your waste? And how do we make your energy and your buildings more manageable and reduce cost and that sort of thing? That's kind of the narrative we've built. We're looking to build a fifth narrative, which is about the green, because I feel like when it comes to this scale, I think nature-based solution is an important aspect. So we're adding that component, at this scale. So we please watch the space and open to ideas from your side too. I'm running out of time. I realize I have a little shortcut here that skips a lot of the slides and it just goes jump. So I'll just quickly run this demo that gives you a quick idea rather than me demoing it. So this one, I think I have to speak. So you can choose any city. In this case, choose Chennai. And then it quickly tells you what the carbon emissions would be for Chennai. It has data built in that you can replace and improve. And then you can look at built environment, and you can see your current emissions, your business as usual on the target here, and then choose options just like with Edge, how you could reduce, if you have a solar program, how could it make a difference, things like that, right? So, you can actually model these things across built environment, transport, waste, and water, okay? So I have jumped this quite a bit, but please do feel free to ask questions, and if we have time, I can even demo this in front of you. Okay, so what are we looking to do? We are trying to kind of develop a platform that makes it really easy and to cut the middleman. There's too much consulting going on for almost $300,000, $400,000 of consulting to save a city. And even that is not analytically rigorous, okay? We need to just cut that out. I mean, I'm not saying consultants are no good. I feel like let's do the things that can be easily cookie cutter, do that, and then go into the bits that you can add value, right? Where you can bring the design and urban planning and that sort of stuff. Definitely, the spatial side still needs a lot of help, but number crunching should be done at a central level where we can collect the data and share it, right? And so I'm trying to build an engine that we can connect to Google, that has the mobile phone data, that we know how people travel, and then that data is available to all the countries in the world. That's the way we should build a platform. Have the cost data that we can get the best quantity surveys in the world with the best information on what is available, how much does the electric bus cost, and what, compose that and slot it in. That's kind of how we're building this engine. So that really cuts makes it really easy. It's not, the idea is not to cut anything, but really make it simple and easy, especially in developing countries. They don't have the kind of fees to do this. and really kind of quickly get to a plan, the first part, right? And then look at how we could, take it from a plan to an investment. Let me take you through this, okay? So we are working with 2 cities right now as we speak, one in South Africa, where we have just issued a 55 million bond. Actually, it was a 2-tier bond. It's not green, it's just a municipal bond. And the idea was to then, in parallel, kind of help them develop a green cities action plan using the tool. And through that, we would have like a pipeline, right? So we would get a pipeline of what we can do and also set up actions that they can do to make the city greener. The second one is Almaty, closer-ish to home. And here we've signed a mandate to kind of work together. Almaty is very, most Central Asian countries are very centralized. Forgive me if some of you are from there. It's a very the power is all in the center, not so much at the kind of city level, right? So we're trying to kind of help the mayors get a bit more power in the way they handle their cash. Okay, so that's kind of what we're trying to help at the World Bank level, to see that they can borrow money from the capital markets, and we try to give them a scale as to how much, what would it take to convert their city, and that's kind of where we're headed with this, and that's looking good so far. And I think if COVID hadn't hit, we would have been a little bit ahead. But I think, we're trying to kind of make that work and so on, right? I think I've got a few more examples like this and that is on our website. In Ahmedabad, we help them come up with an inventory. We come up with an investment action plan. Look, investment action plan, is necessary, because I think we need to have a sense that we're moving, right? If it's just about policy, it takes a long time. We need to have a quick win now. It's a catalyst. And once you have that, you can get other things. I'll explain what I mean by that. So we met Ho Chi Minh City, the political leaders there, and we showed them the Green Action Plan. But they said, what? Our big issue is we only have 4% public transport. 4%, right? Think about that, right? Singapore has almost 40% public transport, right? So, and in a large poor country, that's very wasteful to have just 4% public transport in a socialist country, that too. So their aim was to make it at least 25%. And so we used the tool to figure out, okay, what are the things that would work for you, right? So this was more of kind of a sensitivity analysis. So in fact, we took them to Singapore to show how the vehicle quotas could work, right? Just to get them a sense of what sort of things will work for them and so on. You can see some of this stuff. And the main thing is not to just keep banging on about climate change with the city. They really have significant issues to tackle, and their money is so precious. Whatever the little bit they get from property tax, it has to be used for important things. So if we can make this about reducing congestion, because that has an economic impact for the city, right? If you can make this about better air quality, that also has economic impact, but it gives them the votes. If you have bad days, you're going to lose the election. Not that it matters in Vietnam so much, but generally it does. And then, for the people, if they can save operating costs through electric vehicles or whatever, that could be a way that could work. All right. So look, we do business in this space. We, in the municipal space, we do a lot of investments over the years, almost 13 billion, many projects around the world. And what my aim is to make those projects green, right? To kind of shift our investment portfolio. Some of them are already green, right? But really be more deliberate about what we're doing. And from a city perspective, try to kind of inspire them to kind of look at it as a whole rather than bits. Try to see how we can be quantitative and deliberate and urgent about 10 years horizon. How do we get there, right? How do we really get, and being really clever about how they use the financing and really help them raise money from the outside world, from the private sector, because I think just depending on national government is not going to be the way, right? And then, if we can get them to get new jobs, boost pride, we can have little epicenters of green action around the world, and that could really take off. That's our hope. So that's my last slide as well.